A warm welcome to this Made at the Library event featuring Andrew Nagorski and his most recent book, Saving Freud, The Rescuers Who Brought Him to Freedom. Andy has told a dramatic tale that is well chronicled in the Library of Congress Sigmund Freud papers. I am Meg McAleer. I am a historian in the Library of Congress Manuscript Division, overseeing its modern diplomatic, military, and presidential collections. In a career twist that I could never have anticipated as a historian of American history, I had the extraordinary experience of being the lead archivist for the Sigmund Freud papers for more than 20 years, following the seminal work of my colleague, Alan Tycrow. Joining me today as co-moderator is my colleague, Josh Levy. The manuscript division was incredibly fortunate in 2020, yes, during the pandemic, that Josh joined us as our historian of science and technology. He is the current curator of the Sigmund Freud papers and related psychoanalytic collections, in addition to overseeing the division's many holdings on science, the history of science and technology. So a quick reminder that this session is being recorded. If you choose to participate, and please do, keep in mind that your comments and questions will be included in the recording as a record of the event. This is your shot at immortality. You can submit your questions in the Q&A. We will use the chat feature to post links to resources. Before we get to Saving Freud, I'd like to tell you very briefly about this library's Sigmund Freud papers. They constitute the world's largest collection of Sigmund Freud's writings. The story of how they came to the Library of Congress is itself a tale of rescuers. In this case, the rescuers were a group of analysts in New York, many of them emigres from war in Europe and the Holocaust. In 1951, they organized themselves into the Sigmund Freud archives and began to collect Freud's writings and letters that were at risk of being lost during the aftermath of World War II. But because the Sigmund Freud archives was not a repository or a research facility, it entered into an agreement with the Library of Congress, which became the custodian of this growing collection. That partnership with the Sigmund Freud archives continues today. Many other people donated Freud's letters and writings as well, most notably Anna Freud, who donated her father's papers that remained in her possession. The collection today comprises 48,000 items and contains letters, drafts of Freud's writings, family papers, legal documents and certificates, calendars, notebooks, patient records, photographs, films, objects, and hundreds of interviews conducted by Sigmund Freud Archives founding secretary Kurt Eisler, largely in the early 1950s, not awfully long after Freud's death. Nobody would be more surprised than Sigmund Freud himself that his collection was at the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C. But it gets even better. In 2015, thanks largely to the efforts of Tony Chris, who was then executive director of Sigmund Freud Archives, the Library of Congress received funding from the Polanski Foundation to digitize the collection. In 2017, the online Freud collection went live, making the collection available worldwide. We've put a link to the online collection in the chat. One final note, in addition to the Sigmund Freud papers, the Library of Congress holds hundreds of collections documenting the life of Sigmund Freud and the history of psychoanalysis, including the papers of Freud family members, his colleagues and patients, and many others you will hear about today, including Anna Freud, Princess Marie Bonaparte, and Max Schur, among many others. For easy reference, the Sigmund Freud online collection includes a list of these collections with links to their catalog records and finding aids. I was going to do a screenshot of the list, but the list is too long. So instead, I did a word cloud, my first word cloud in years. Josh?
Thanks, Meg. So we are very pleased to welcome Andy Nagorski, who was born in Scotland to Polish parents. Andy moved to the United States as an infant, and he has rarely stopped moving since. He's an award-winning journalist. He's an author who spent more than 3 decades as a foreign correspondent and editor for Newsweek. He served as the magazine's bureau chief in Hong Kong, Rome, Bonn, Berlin, Warsaw, and Moscow. And in 1982, he gained international notoriety when the Soviet government, which was angry about his enterprising reporting, expelled him from the country. Andy now lives in St. Augustine, Florida, but he continues to travel extensively, writing for numerous publications, and he's the author of 8 books, including Hitlerland, American Eyewitnesses to the Nazi Rise to Power in 1941, The Year Germany Lost the War, and The Nazi Hunters. Andy's also chairman of the board of the Polish-American Freedom Foundation. He's a member of the board of the Israel Council on Foreign Relations, a member of the Council on Foreign Relations and the Overseas Press Club, and a former member of the board of the Jacksonville World Affairs Council. His latest book, which we're here to talk about today, Saving Freud, The Rescuers Who Brought Him to Freedom, is an account of a coordinated effort to persuade Freud to leave Nazi-controlled Vienna and emigrate to England. That effort included Princess Marie Bonaparte, a wealthy member of Europe's high society and an innovative psychoanalyst and sexologist; Ernest Jones, a Welsh physician who was president of the International Psychoanalytic Association; William Bullitt, an American ambassador who had co-written a book with Freud; Anna Freud, Freud's youngest daughter, who later became a major figure in psychoanalysis herself; Max Schur, Freud's personal doctor, a fellow Viennese Jew who delayed his emigration from Austria to attend to Freud; and oddly, Anton Sauerwald, a Nazi bureaucrat who was charged with overseeing Freud's assets, but who nonetheless played a critical role in Freud's escape. Saving Freud, it's a dramatic account of an international effort to rescue Freud, a mission that was complicated by Freud's stubborn refusal to leave until his daughter Anna was arrested by the Gestapo in the days following the Nazi takeover of Austria. It was almost too late. It certainly was too late for close members of Freud's family who perished in the concentration camps. This book has received rave reviews. The Washington Post has said Nagorski tells a riveting news story, one that shows just how narrow Freud's escape from the Nazi genocide was. The Wall Street Journal called it a psycho-biographical thriller about the limits of genius, and The Guardian wrote, thrilling as edge-of-your-seat gripping as any heist movie. So today, Meg and I are going to begin with a Q&A discussion with Andy, after which we'll open it up to questions from the audience. And as a reminder, please use the Q&A function to submit your questions, not the chat. We'll use the chat as a space for the hosts to post relevant links to resources. So now, without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. Andy, again, thank you so much for joining us today. Meg?
Hi. So Andy, thank you again, as Josh has said, for joining us. We're very honored that you were able to do so. So I remember from the time you first reached out to us when you were researching this book, I wanted to ask you this question: what led you to this topic? In my experience, people who know a lot about Freud are nevertheless surprised that despite his renown, he was almost a victim of genocide. Those who know the Holocaust very well don't necessarily put Freud in that narrative. So what brought you to this topic?
Well, first of all, Meg and Josh, thank you very much. The library has been wonderful, a wonderful aid in this and all of your resources. What brought me to this topic, when I'm in between books, I'm trying to go through all sorts of materials, reading various accounts, documents, and trying to think what is a story that maybe is less known that I can now tell. And I remember specifically that eureka moment with Freud. I was reading the memoirs of Stefan Zweig, who was a brilliant writer, Viennese Jew, at the turn of the century. He was probably the most popular writer in Europe at the time, certainly in the German language, but in general. He wrote novels, novellas, plays. And he wrote a wonderful memoir, this memoir called A World of Yesterday, in which he described meeting Freud in Vienna in that interwar period. And he has some very interesting observations about Freud, which intrigued me. there were already things that I did not feel as familiar with. I think Freud is one of these iconic figures we think we all know, but in reality, his personality, he was a revolutionary thinker, but he was a very conservative individual in his habits and his whole lifestyle in Vienna. All that was fairly new to me. And then Zweig made the decision to leave Vienna in 1934 after Hitler had taken power in nearby Germany. He obviously figured out this is too dangerous here. But then the next mention of Freud in Zweig's autobiography is when he shows up in London in 1938 after the Anschluss, after Germany has incorporated Austria, and he alludes to Freud's narrow escape from Austria. So two questions immediately come to my mind. Why did Freud hang around for so long? Somebody who was so insightful about the human condition. Why did he put himself and his family in so much danger? And then how did he get out at that point once the Hitler was literally down the street? So that was a starting point. And then the fact that I knew that there was so much primary source material in the Library of Congress and elsewhere was, of course, a huge advantage in this. You're always looking not only what was the story, but how can I tell this story? And just a word on this, I think the fact that Freud was such a prolific correspondent with everybody. He wrote letters to everybody. He responded to everyone. And you read those letters, it's like you're there. He was a very good writer. And I feel for future historians who will try to have to sort through text and emails, and they're not going to get the texture of these kinds of letters.
I just want to add too that he generally did not retain copies of his correspondence, outgoing correspondence. So it was a Herculean effort to collect and assemble them.
Yeah, most of the people who were on the receiving end were the ones who retained copies. Yeah.
Andy, I wonder if I could ask a question about the city of Vienna. So the book is largely structured around these sort of character studies, short biographies of Freud's rescuers. You tease out their relationships with Freud and kind of lay out all the unique abilities that each one of them brought to bear that finally became useful in his rescue. But Freud's relationship with the city of Vienna underlies the story all the way through. He seems to love the city. He seems seduced by it, almost blinded by it. He seems to think that the city could never betray him. Could you lay out a little bit about just the Vienna that Freud saw?
Yes, I mean, this is the Vienna. He grew up in Imperial Vienna. It was the capital of the Habsburg Empire, an empire which contained about 50 million people, which in those days, that was quite a lot. About 9 major nationalities, numerous minorities. And it's everyone who's been to Vienna knows it's a gorgeous city, and a lot of the architecture and the layout dates from that period. And it was also a city and an empire that was relatively tolerant for its time. There was plenty of anti-Semitism in Vienna, and as in any part of Europe. And of course, that was where Hitler at a certain point as a young man would go and sort of feed off some of the most anti-Semitic elements there too. But it had a significant Jewish population, about 10% of the population, who did very well in music, the arts, literature, academia, science. And Freud himself, while he identified as a Jew, was not a non-religious Jew, but he never denied his Jewish heritage, and he felt it wasn't a barrier. When he did confront anti-Semitism at times, or his family members did, he always met it straight on. He didn't try to duck it. He would immediately go after somebody who made an anti-Semitic remark. So he felt that it was just something you lived with, but it wasn't a barrier. So he really felt, and he also felt even after World War I, when Austria became what was considered a rump state, a pale shadow of its former self, that it would still maintain some separation from Germany, even though Austrians were always ambivalent about their relationship with Germany and their German identity. And that was from the left and the right. And so he wanted to believe that Austria could maintain its separation from what was happening across the border, and that Austrians were somehow, maybe let us say, gentler than their neighbors to the north. Well, I put it very crudely. It was a little bit of the Sound of Music version of Austria that, of course, we know was rather idealized.
Okay, so I don't know, Josh didn't like this, but I thought Vienna was a character in the book, which I thought was really well developed. But you also developed the biographies of his rescuers. As we come to actually care about these people, we come to feel their urgency as they're trying to get him out of Vienna before it's too late. Josh mentioned them: Ernst Jones, a Welsh psychoanalyst; William Bullitt, an American diplomat; Anton Sauerwald, I'm mispronouncing the name, a Nazi appointed to extract his assets. But I wonder if you could just tell us a little bit about the two women who were part of these rescuers: Anna Freud, his youngest daughter, and then Princess Marie Bonaparte, who was the great grandniece of Napoleon Bonaparte, incredibly wealthy, incredibly influential. And by the way, we have both their papers at the Library of Congress, in addition to other prominent women within the psychoanalytic field, and there were many. So what about these two women?
Yes, I mean, first of all, this is a book which is about Freud, but it is about this whole circle of people he attracted to him and who were part of his circle, and eventually were the reason he was saved. And if you start with the one family member, Freud has 6 children. Martha and Sigmund Freud had 6 children. Anna was the youngest. The 5 other had all moved out of the household at the normal age, had raised families and so forth. One other daughter had died at an early age. And Anna, though, stayed in the household. She's there, and she's closest to her father of all the children, and determined she's not only closest personally, but professionally. She's interested in his world. And she tells this story of when she was probably about 14, walking with her father around a district in Vienna, Prater district, where there's some very nice houses. And her father says, "You see these houses? They have beautiful facades. Well, what's behind the facades is not necessarily beautiful." Wow. And that, his way of very simply instructing, well, the human mind is the same way. It's much more complex than what you see. And she was fascinated by this. She would sit in. He had these Wednesday evening sessions with his colleagues, just as the psychoanalytic movement was getting going. And she would be sitting perched somewhere on the corner and listening into these sessions as she was growing up. And then she becomes a child psychoanalyst herself. And by the way, in that early psychoanalytic movement, you would have a mentor who would psychoanalyze you before you could go on to become a psychoanalyst. Freud was his daughter's mentor, which later
controversial
would not be acceptable practice, and he had himself admitted it as much. But they were very close, and she's usually seen, and she's very protective of her father. And this goes all the way through until the moment when they're literally confronting the Nazis at the door. So she is a key part of this story. And at this, by the way, she also is seen usually as portrayed as sort of an old-fashioned spinsterish. Well, in fact, she had a very close relationship with an American woman who came over to Vienna in the 1920s to have Anna Freud analyze her 4 kids, because she'd gone through a pretty traumatic marriage and that was falling apart. And that woman was Dorothy Burlingham Tiffany, the granddaughter of the founder of Tiffany and Company. So she and Anna develop what becomes a lifetime relationship, and Dorothy moves in 2 floors above the Freud's apartment, so they're in constant touch, and then follows them to England. So there's this partnership there. So the women and she plays a role also in the rescue. And then there's Marie Bonaparte, who's, I think, one of the most intriguing figures. If you made her up in a novel or in a movie, you'd probably say, no, this is too much. As you said, she's the her grandfather was Napoleon's brother. And so the name itself, Napoleon, Bonaparte, is pretty significant. So makes her celebrity, high society. She is also very wealthy. Her mother, who died early, had left a lot of money, and she's raised by a rather distant father. And then she's married off to the Prince of Greece and Denmark. European royalty is complicated. She becomes part of European royalty. They have a fairly distant marriage, although not acrimonious, it seems. But she also is sexually very active, as a lot of people who are attracted to Freud are, but is frustrated. She never feels fulfilled, and she seeks psychological treatment in France, and then eventually asks someone to introduce her to Freud. She gets to Freud, and she starts going to Vienna, and they instantly develop an incredibly close relationship in terms of her interest, his interest, and a way of, he treats her almost like a member of the family, confiding in her. And then she not only becomes a psychoanalyst herself, supporting the psychoanalytic movement, developing it, and using a lot of her wealth to do that, but then becomes a key figure again in the rescue and in that moment when he's in danger.
Okay, so continuing with my kind of analogy of characters in your book, Vienna, these rescuers, cancer is a character in the book.
Yeah.
As I think any cancer patient or their caregiver would appreciate. So it's the ever-present specter in Freud's life. So can you just really super briefly just tell us about Freud's cancer, when he was diagnosed, what the trajectory of his disease was?
As we all know, Freud loved his cigars, and that's the character, the normal photo with the cigar and so forth, and that was true. The caricature was right, and he once said, "Unless I smoke, I can't think. Unless I think, I can't write, and I'm always writing." And so he loved his cigars, and he would obsess about getting good cigars because he didn't consider Austrian cigars good enough. And he'd be writing to people, "Get me these cigars, those cigars." Well, he paid a price. In 1923, he had his first major operation for cancer of the jaw, where they had to remove parts. I don't want to get into the medical details, but
We've got a diagram on that screen.
yeah. Oh, yes, you have the diagram. Yeah, so they're removing part of the jaw, the gum, and in that, for the rest of his life, he lives until 1939, which, by the way, gets into this whole thing, how on the cusp of the Holocaust, which just as World War II is starting, which is again something most people don't realize. But all that time during that final 15, 16 years of his life, he's having operation after operation. They're constantly having to put in new prostheses into his jaw, these are not like modern ones. They're very heavy, clunky. And here's another way Anna Freud made herself indispensable. Even his caregivers had a hard time pulling these things in and out and cleaning them. Anna was the only one who could do that adeptly. And so in every way, this only reinforced again the tie between Anna and her father. And it also made him, he was a man who was always convinced of his own, he was worried about his own mortality. Will he be able to live long enough to do all the things he needs to do? And the cancer was, a huge presence in everyone's life, in his life and everyone around him.
So, Andy, you describe a Freud that is very deeply absorbed in his work, even amid kind of the global chaos of Hitler's rise. But Freud's not unaware of the rise of Hitler and the Nazis in Germany. He's not unaware of what that meant for Jews that are living there and for psychoanalysis. He knows that the Nazis burned his books in Berlin on May
Yes.
10th, 1933, as a form of, they say, Jewish pseudoscience, among a lot of other books they find objectionable. And Freud notes that event in his diary. And I'll also take the excuse to highlight a new acquisition of ours, just a postcard that Freud sent to Heinrich Meng early the following year, which contains a pretty vague reference to some disturbing days, which seems like a pretty clear allusion to that book burning and the other things that are going on. And there's plenty of documentation of this, including a letter that you quote, where Freud writes to Ernest Jones and he says, quote, "What progress are we making? In the Middle Ages, they would have burned me. Nowadays, they're content with burning my books," in a bit of Freudian dark humor, right? But I think it gets to one of the central questions that both Meg and I have about the book, which is, how is it exactly that you read Freud's state of mind at this time? Why all this bravado? Why this stubborn refusal to panic? Why the refusal to act at all?
Yeah, I think it is, you're exactly right, that Freud understood sort of what we call the totalitarian dark forces of his time. Both, by the way, not just the rise of the Nazis, but the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia. He viewed all of this with alarm, and anything that destroyed the individual and the individual conscience. And what I found in a lot of my research, not just for this book, but in previous books about the interwar years, it is very easy to say in retrospect, oh, I would have known, I would have understood, much less what I might have not done or not done. And I found one of the things, again, that attracted me to Freud's story was, here was this man who was in many ways the most insightful person of his era, and yet he had difficulty applying it to his own situation. He always thought Austria would be somewhat different. He didn't have illusions that what was happening in Germany, but he thought it would be different. And on a very prosaic level, sometimes I say, I now live in Florida. When there's a hurricane coming and you're getting all these warnings, in the beginning you're scrambling to get all these things. And then pretty soon, next time you say, oh, it's not gonna, it'll probably miss us. And I think there was a little bit of that. I think someone who was so set in his ways, who had his daily routine from the moment he woke up to when the barber came in the morning to trim his mustache and beard, when he met his patients, when he did his walk around and in the cafes and read the newspapers. It is very difficult, especially as you're getting older, to say, oh, this may be all blown to pieces and become irrelevant. You want to think this is going to somehow bypass us. And in that sense, one thing that really struck me all the way through writing this book and researching this book, how human he was. He was not that distant, cold figure that you see often, Herr Doctor, professor, who's unapproachable. He had a wonderful ironic sense of humor. I would say the joke about burning books was not one of his better efforts, but there were others. Just a quick example, when he met one time in his life, he met Einstein in 1927, and everyone's saying, oh, who are these? What do these two men talk about? And Freud says, yes, we had a very pleasant talk. He knows as much about psychoanalysis as I know about physics, so it was all fine. He had this dry humor, but he really had this desire to live out his life and not to move from Vienna. And I don't sit in judgment of that. It just was the reality, and everybody around him had to dislodge him from that reality. Yeah,
I love that description of World War II as a hurricane. There's a wonderful book of oral histories of Pacific Islanders living through World War II in Oceania called The Typhoon of War, in which they describe World War II from their perspective in very similar terms.
Yeah.
One of, I think, the most moving things in the collection is this cryptic diary that Freud keeps from, I think it's the last 10 years of his life, from 1929 to 1939. I wonder if part of the reason why he's doing it is also because of his health, wanting to keep a chronicle. But it's very cryptic. Sometimes you only have one word for a daily entry. It's almost like the haiku of diaries, you have to a few words, you can read a lot into it. But, by far the most dramatic entries are from March 1938. And it's staccato, You can read it up here in the German or below in English. The end of Austria, union with Germany, Hitler in Vienna, search of press and house, Jones, princess, and then the last one absolutely stops your heart, Anna with Gestapo. So things are moving really fast. We've had a lot of bravado over the years, Freud's refusal to leave. Can you kind of unravel for us what's happening these days? And does this shift his thinking at all?
Yeah. Well, this is the period when everything comes together, accelerates. Hitler, of course, had from the very earliest days when he wrote Mein Kampf, had talked about his desire to incorporate Austria into the Reich. But throughout the 30s, Austrian rulers, even though they were right-wing dictators, probably would qualify as fascists, but not in the same sense as the Nazis. They were trying to fend off Hitler and the Nazis and an incorporation. And one of the ironies is that they saw as an ally in this initially Mussolini, who did not want Hitler to stir up the Germans in the South Tyrol in Italy. And so he thought having Austria as a buffer state was not a bad idea. Well, of course, Hitler then totally dominated that relationship, and that disappeared. And whatever protection Austria got from Mussolini disappeared as well. So what you have is you have one Austrian dictator, Adolphus, who's assassinated by Austrian Nazis in 1934. And by 1938, the pressure is really cranking up on Austria. Hitler calls in his successor and basically says, surrender your power, which he does. And so suddenly, the German troops are just crossing the border. The Austrians didn't even try to resist because they knew it was hopeless. The Schuschnigg, the chancellor, resigns, and you have, as you say, Hitler in Vienna on the 14th. On the 15th, he makes this speech in very close to Freud's neighborhood, where he's saying, now Austria is going to be just a protectorate of the Third Reich, a province of the Third Reich. And you have, at the same time, these thugs showing up in the Freud apartment, Berggasse, in Vienna, and in the press of the psychoanalytic press, which is owned by Freud and his son, which is just a few blocks away. And they are coming in. This is full Nazi thugdom. They are coming in, guys, whirling guns and making threats. And no one quite knows yet where is all this going to lead. And even the invaders are a little uncertain. But they come in, and here's the beauty of this drama is the performance of some of the players. Now, Martha Freud, his wife, is one of the gets less prominence than her daughter Anna, but Martha Freud has a presence of mind when she opens the door and these thugs come in and making threats and says, "Oh, won't the guests come in, be seated? Maybe you want to put down your umbrellas or whatever," and then immediately offers her, "Oh, we have some money here if you'd like to help yourselves." And they try to diffuse this. And she sends Anna Freud to the family safe, where she pulls out the equivalent of about $800, a huge amount in that day, and offers it to these people, just thinking, we'll buy them off. And they're not quite sure what to do. They want the money, and it's still not very centrally organized. And Freud suddenly shows up, this rather stern figure, and just stares at them, and they grab the money and back out. So you have this happening in the press. Freud's son Martin is also held at gunpoint, and they're robbed, and he's trying to hide various bank account records and so forth, feeling that the Nazis are going to use that to incriminate his father. And then, of course, the most dramatic moment is when Oh, yeah. And by the way, that first day when those raids happen, and finally they are left alone, and Anna Freud is sitting at the table with her parents and with her brother, Martin Freud, and she says, should we all just kill ourselves? She asked that question. And Freud says no, because why would we do that? Because they want us to? Freud's still defiant. He realizes things have changed, but yet, and then Ernest Jones gets in from London, Marie Bonaparte a couple of days later, and they start talking about it. And at first, Freud is still resistant to leaving, although they're starting the process of trying to figure out how could we do this. Ernest Jones goes back to England to try to get entry permits for the Freuds, which is no mean feat in those days for any Jewish family, even as prominent as the Freuds. And Marie Bonaparte and Anna Freud are trying to figure out how can we negotiate with these Nazis and get a deal. But then Anna Freud is called into the Gestapo, as he notes, and she disappears for the whole day. And at that point, Freud realizes we have to get out of here any way we can, assuming she comes out of that. Because she says, Martha and I, we don't have long to live. He's already 80 years old, but or 81, but Anna has a long way to live and a lot of life ahead of her, or it should be. So he said, and then he is all for getting out as soon as possible. So that whole period is just. Those are just the sketches of the details, but it's just an amazing period of tension.
Can you describe also what happens to Anna when she's taken to Gestapo headquarters? Because Max Schur gives her something, right? To take.
Because what?
Max Schur gives her something.
Yeah, this is interesting too. As close as Anna was with her father, she never told him that she and Martin, her older brother, who was there and dealing with the publishing house, came to their personal doctor, Max Schur, to Freud's personal doctor, before she was taken, and said, and they knew they would be grilled, and said, can you give us something if it gets too awful so we can commit suicide? And they give us cyanide. They never told their father that.
I remember reading that she thought that they kept delaying. They wouldn't take her in to interrogate her. And she thought that if she was still there at the end of the day and had not been brought in to be interrogated, that she would be swept up with everyone there and taken off. And so she was prepared. I forget if that comes from Martin's account or whatever, but yeah, it's just kind of the realization of how this could go.
And what's interesting is, as they, by asking for poison if needed and so forth, she was aware of all the risks. And yet when she was driven off, Martin Freud saw her through the window. She said it was like she stepped into the Gestapo car. There were 2 Gestapo cars waiting, and it looked like she was going off on a shopping trip. She didn't want to show any fear, although, I mean, the fear must have been immense.
Oh my goodness. Oh, wow. And also you make wonderful use of Martin's memoirs or account. And it's I want to go back and reread. It's been a few years since I've read it, but you make me want to go back and reread. So actually, Josh, too.
Yeah, I wanted to kind of circle back to those Nazis that have showed up at Freud's home and are tormenting him. So there's one that you feature especially, of course, and that's Anton Sauerwald. In the book, you describe him. I have just looked through to see what your exact references are. You call him totally out of place, mysterious, and duplicitous. And I was wondering if I could ask you to just pin down the meaning of Sauerwald's participation in the rescue a bit more, and then kind of the larger implications of out of place stories like Sauerwald's for, people that might be looking for larger lessons about how people have behaved or could behave under authoritarian regimes in general.
Yes, I mean, Anton Sauerwald for me was one of the big surprises of the story when I was doing the research. You don't look, you look to certain people, groups of friends, relatives to be, the ones who are the rescuers. You don't expect someone to play a positive role who's a Nazi. And it's an ambiguous role, but it's a very important one. Anton Sauerwald was appointed by the Nazis to be what was called a trustee, someone who would oversee the examination of all of Freud's assets and determine how these trustees were there for wealthy Jewish families to determine how best to extort them. But the rest of their fate was still not clear. Remember, again, this is before the Holocaust. There's been plenty of violent anti-Semitism and Kristallnacht, but there hasn't been, the full Holocaust is not yet. That's still in the future. So it's not clear, are they going to let him go? Are they going to put him in a concentration camp or something worse? And Sauerwald is someone who was a fervent Nazi, and he comes into Freud's apartment and the psychoanalytic press spouting anti-Semitic rhetoric. He looks like the stereotype of a Nazi. But it turns out he was educated, he had a degree in chemistry from the University of Vienna, and one of his favorite professors was an old Jewish professor who happened to have been a friend of Freud's. This chemistry professor has since died. But over time, he's spending a lot of time in Freud's apartment and office. He is reading Freud's works and is very impressed by what he writes. And he seems to identify Freud with his former professor and begins to mellow. In fact, when at one point, when a group of SS troopers come in and into the apartment, are acting incredibly boorish and threatening, Max Sauerwald says to Anna Freud, "Oh, those are just Prussians. They don't know how to behave." Really trying to ingratiate himself with Anna Freud. But the key element is here: these trustees could determine what would happen to the people they were overseeing. And there was a flight tax that was imposed that was going to be, you assessed all the assets, and then 25% of it was supposedly a flight tax. Usually this was much inflated, and that might be a ticket out, or you could put so many obstacles in the way that there'd be no ticket out. And at a certain point, as Sauerwald was going through all the financial records of Freud, he realized Freud had foreign bank accounts. Now, until the Nazis took over, until the Anschluss in Austria, that was perfectly legit. There's nothing illegal about that. And since Freud had foreign patients, particularly American and British patients, it was hardly unusual that he also had bank accounts for other currencies. But if under the Nazis that became instantly illegal, and if Sauerwald had taken this information to his superiors, they could have used that as an excuse never to allow Freud to leave. So this was his decision ultimately to keep silent on that until Freud left was probably the last but most important hurdle for Freud. And Anna Freud always credited Sauerwald for doing that. And in fact, when Sauerwald was put on trial after the war, she wrote a letter in support of him because she felt that he had played that important role. And I think, again, to the broader question, what does this say about who plays what role? In all of these situations, it's not always black and white. It's not, you don't just have heroes and perpetrators and heroes. There are people who behave in different ways, and especially when they come face to face and begin to, they have that human interaction, which may make them act not necessarily according to the ideology of the time.
So I just want to catch people up. Of course, I knew Freud got out of Vienna, but when I was reading your book, I did find I was like on the edge of my seat, are they going to make it? So just want to refer people to this PowerPoint slide. In the upper left corner, there is Freud with Princess Marie Bonaparte and Ambassador William Bullitt at Gare de l'Est in Paris. They have made it out. And I don't know if how many people know, we have quite a few Freud home movies in the collection that have been digitized beautifully by MVRS and are available online for streaming. And the lower right-hand corner image was of Freud resting at the Paris home of Marie Bonaparte. So I invite people to take them. So another movie that I love, because I think it's absolutely beautiful and it's in color, was again taken by Marie Bonaparte. She loved obviously technology and film, and it's of Freud's birthday celebration in London. They've arrived, they're safe, they're in London. Hollywood, happy ending to the story in May 1939. And our colleague Elizabeth is going to see if she can play a clip from this movie, which is just beautiful. You get to see his presence and whatnot, what people gave him. But we know that it was not completely a happy ending to the story, that there's Anna Freud and Sigmund Freud, because obviously Freud is not going to live to see another birthday. In fact, he dies in September of that year. This is May. He dies in September. And then also there are absent family members. Oh, by the way, these are the dogs. That is the housekeeper, Paula Fichtel, and they would tie birthday messages on the dogs, who would then deliver them to Freud, except for that one that one appears to be eating it eventually. But anyway, really super cute. But it is, they're absent family members. And so this is not a completely happy ending to the story. So here I show a list of names of women, and then a photograph above. Who are these women? And this is a list that Freud sends to Princess Marie Bonaparte in November of 1938. So after they're safe in London. Who are these women?
This is Freud's mother at the center, I believe, and it's the birthday of his mother. And Freud had 5 sisters. All 5 are there. One sister had was married and into the Bernays family and moved to the United States in the late 19th century. But she evidently came back for this celebration. I think it was probably at her 90th birthday, her mother's 90th birthday. And about 4 of these sisters, I think all of them by that time were widowed, or who were in their 70s, stayed in Vienna. It's a little, and one of the things unclear why they stayed. But again, at the time, most people still believed in many places that you could ride this out. And Freud and a brother left money for them for their upkeep, and whether it was a matter of simply there wasn't time to organize their escape as well, or they just were reluctant to leave, they stayed. Very soon, Freud became very alarmed by the further news from Germany about what was happening to Jews, and asked Marie Bonaparte to try to get them out if possible. She tried, she looked into it, but there was no way at that point. In fact, Marie Bonaparte was instrumental in the saving of many Jews in Austria and Germany, but she did not succeed with her 4 sisters. All 4 of them died in the Holocaust. All 4 were sent first to Theresienstadt, and then one of them died in Theresienstadt, apparently of starvation, and 3 died in the gas chambers when they were moved on. So it is, sometimes people ask, well, would the Nazis really have touched Freud himself? I think the fate of his sisters offers a pretty definitive answer to that.
Well, I think tragically you're absolutely right. It really highlights how nearly he did not get out and did not survive. Yeah. So Josh, I think his screen froze a while ago.
I am back. Can you hear me, Meg?
I am.
Oh, good. Fantastic. And we have reached our audience Q&A portion of the event. So if you have questions, then please put them in the Q&A. I will moderate. While we're waiting for questions to come in, I believe, Meg, you had a question that you were dying to ask.
So Josh is going to be reading through the questions and moderating them. It's a question I have to ask. And, we try to be objective as historians, very dispassionate. But I found when I was in the past, and when I was reading your book, I was becoming very angry at Freud for his stubbornness in refusing to leave. He was dying. His daughter was not, and his wife was not. And then just that bravado that Josh and you had talked about earlier, and even Anna Freud picks it up. At one point in, I think, February 1938, she writes to Ernest Jones that we are not panicking like everyone else. I mean, she picks up her father's line. But I found I became angry with Freud for being so stubborn. So I just, as true confessions, did you have that, those moments when you were writing this, researching and writing it, where you're like, come on?
Well, I didn't have that anger, certainly, again, because I've seen too many, maybe, the point I made to Josh earlier, that you always in retrospect think you knew more at the time than you did, or you wanted to see, and the tendency for us to see what we want to see and to close our eyes to things we don't want to see. I never underestimate that. And I've been in situations, I was a correspondent in the Soviet Union and in Poland before the fall of the Berlin Wall. And to say, we should have known that this and that will happen in this and that sequence. Well, again, that's very easy in retrospect. I like to think that I had a pretty good idea that the system was going to crumble at some point, but when, how? So I try, I think, again, his basic understanding of the inhumanity of the Nazi ideology or the Soviet ideology, the Bolshevik ideology was profound, and is of human nature and of the brutality of humans. And but he just did not want to apply it to himself. Yes, it was frustrating for me, but not it didn't engender kind of anger. It just pretty. It's almost, you feel like you're putting Freud on the couch then. I'm not sure I'm qualified to do that.
We do have a question that's come in here from Lillian Weisberg. And the question is exactly how the communication between the American, English, and French diplomats functioned in this story. What was the sort of nuts and bolts of that communication?
That's a good question. And one of the things that, I mean, the diplomatic community in Vienna was pretty small, and a key conduit, particularly during this time, again, was Marie Bonaparte, because she was officially part of the Greek legation. She was a member of the Greek royal family, and when the Nazis were going in and out of Freud's apartment, she was smuggling things out, documents, often literally under her skirts, our coats, and she was telling other diplomats what was going on. Dorothy Burlingham, who I mentioned, was Anna's partner, who lived 2 floors above, had a direct line of communications with Anna. If you go into the Freud Museum in Vienna, Berggasse 19, in what was Anna's room, you can see a phone wiring there exposed. Dorothy Burlingham had a phone direct line put between her apartment and Anna's room downstairs. So she could just pick up the phone and say, what's going on? What are they doing now in the apartment? And then William Bullitt, who was a US ambassador in Paris and who had developed a close relationship with Freud for various reasons, first his own psychoanalytic consultations, but then their shared hatred of Woodrow Wilson, which is another story. But he had put in one of his closest friends and diplomats in charge of the US mission in Vienna, and he had them come visit the apartment constantly to literally show the flag. They would drive up in an embassy car where it would be this man, John Wiley, or his wife, or other embassy officials with a US flag on the hood. And this was the days, again, where Hitler was still ambivalent about how much he wanted to be open about the repression and the fear that he was instilling, and he still wanted to keep the U.S. out of any future conflict. So he didn't want to stir things up with the U.S. So the idea of having missions of listening to U.S. diplomats and Bullitt, for instance, called in the German ambassador in Paris, where he was serving, and told him, look, if anything happens to Freud, we are watching you every step of the way. So this kind of diplomatic pressure, I think, also helped navigate this process, helped make it possible for eventually the Germans to say, the Nazis to say, it will be easier just to allow Freud out than to keep him boxed in and then deal with the consequences.
I remember this one telegram from Wiley saying Freud in danger. It's kind of like act now. So we have another question, actually, from a former colleague. Hi, Karen. I was taken with your mention of Stefan Zweig. Although Zweig left earlier, it seems that his deep love of Vienna made his life after leaving unbearably sad. Did Freud have a similar love of Vienna, creating a feeling of displacement?
Well, there are two parts. Good question. First of all, Freud never wanted to leave Vienna, although at times he was ambivalent about it. He would complain about it as any big city dweller does. This or that is irritating, but he really loved Vienna. But the only other place he'd ever considered going to was England. He was only in the United States once. He really, even though he had a lot of American patients and supporters, he sort of had a typical European continental attitude towards these primitive Americans, very condescending. And
he had stomach troubles while he was here. It was not good.
Yeah, he didn't like the food. He blamed him for his stomach troubles and so forth. But he had two half brothers, his father had been married earlier and had a family. His wife had died before he married Freud's mother. And they were a good deal older than Freud. And when Freud was 19, he visited them in England. And he wrote some, again, very interesting letters about his impressions of that visit. He's saying, England has got a lot of fog, and the sort of people can be a little morose at times. The food can be lousy, but this is a place that can be a little boring. But I can imagine if I had to live anywhere else, I could live here. Yeah, it sort of suits my temperament. And so and then when he comes to England, he is received as a conquering hero. There are literally people lined up at the train station coming to his house with flowers and letters, and it's headline news. Freud was a huge celebrity, and the fact that he was getting out and escaping what was happening in Germany and Austria was front page news. And he was stunned by his reception. He said, I never knew I was a celebrity. I am here. Well, he was a celebrity before, but in Vienna, people were much more low key about it on a daily basis. If you went out to the cafe or to a cigar, nobody went oohed and awed about him. But in England, people were really just could not get enough of Freud. And so he was very happy about that. And then also that he had a son in England who was an architect who helped redesign, get him a house that they redesigned and really recreated much of the atmosphere of his old apartment, which is now the Freud Museum in London. Again, wonderful to see, and where many of his belongings eventually ended up, including the famous couch. So for him, London was a great place for the final period. But Zweig, unfortunately, he left England, I think, in 1940, and then went to the US for a little while, then to Brazil with his wife, but suffered from tremendous depression, hearing all the news from Europe. And he and his wife committed suicide in Brazil in 1942. He could not live with the thought of what he knew was happening in his country.
Andy, this has been absolutely fantastic. And again, I recommend the book so highly to everyone. It is absolutely riveting. It is also extremely good history. I'm sorry, we've run out of time and we won't be able to get to everyone's questions. So I apologize for that. Andy, thank you. And
Thank you so much to you and Josh.
we look forward to seeing you again, researching your next book. So make sure it's a topic that includes us.
I will try.
And
Thanks.
thank everyone for attending this Made at the Library event.